Chapter 26, Introduction to the Biosphere, Section 26.2, Classification of Life. So biologists estimate that there might be anywhere from 5 to 100 million different species found on our planet. Now, this is a big variation. Why? This is because it's not easy to define what a species is. Species essentially represent differences in genetics. And these differences are, for some organisms, aren't that great, while other organisms they are. About 1.8 million species have been classified to date. Some have maybe been overclassified, where the same organism type has been classified as two different species. The way that species are classified is based on the work of Swedish scientist Linnaeus during the 18th century. This classification system is hierarchical. In this example, we have 7 different levels. We go from the most basic level, being the kingdom, down to something called division, then class, then order, then family, then genus, then the individual species. In this case, we're seeing how we classify red maple, or Acer rubrum. So Acer rubrum belongs to the genus Acer. It belongs to the family Acerigis, order Sapindales, class Angiospermae, division Tracheophyta, and kingdom Plantae. Now, modern-day classification systems are both taxonomic and phylogenetic, and are structurally based on Darwin's theory of evolution. Prior to the invention of genetic sequencing, which is a few decades old now, most of the classification of organisms was done taxonomically. So scientists would examine the organisms in terms of their structure, the way their physiology works, and make decisions on which organisms were the same and which organisms were different based on structure and physiology. And they would be able to develop connections between organisms. Now, taxonomic schemes are still generally used for looking at fossils. However, most of the classification that is done today is done phylogenetically, so where we determine genetic connections between organisms. How genetically similar are different organisms, and can we use these genetic similarities to define a line of evolutionary development or connectedness? So let's talk more about species classification. What is a species? Not an easy question to answer. Simple definition: species are the different kinds of organisms found on the Earth, and they're different because they have different genetics, and which results in different adaptations and characteristics. The biological definition of a species is a group of interbreeding organisms that do not ordinarily breed with members of other groups. So this definition, you could have 2 groups of organisms that, if they were put together, could produce viable offspring, but normally they don't. They're separated in space, and therefore they're a separate definition, or separate species. Now, these definitions work well with animals, but not necessarily with plants. There are some plants that are quite different genetically, and if but if they do come together, they can produce a viable offspring. The most obvious way, or the most obvious way to identify different species is where they can't interbreed. And then we know for sure they're very different from each other. So why can't they interbreed? It could be that biology is too different, but species can also not interbreed because they're separated by geography. Here's an interesting question. Dogs. Here's an example where humans have modified the genetic characteristics of once a species of organisms that was once very, very similar, and we've culled certain mutations to produce now very distinct looking organisms that we still call the same species. So here we have 6 different examples of dogs, and you can see they are quite different from each other. Sometimes species can look similar, but they can't interbreed. So the neon tetra and the cardinal tetra will not produce viable offspring. And the fish seems to have the same shape. The only difference is the amount of red in the body, but they are very different species. Here are 2 species that are separated by distance, great distances. The ponderosa pine, which is common in British Columbia, and the red pine, which is common in Manitoba, southern Manitoba, and Ontario. These 2 species naturally don't ever come close to each other, but you could produce a viable offspring between them if you bred them. But despite the fact they can interbreed, a biologist would classify them as different species because they are separated by space, by great distances.